everyone. Thank you so much to the VVAO for inviting me today to speak. I'm really looking forward to talking about equity, what we do, and I think placing some of the findings on the Netherlands in a global perspective as well. What I'll be walking through in the presentation is what equity is, what we're doing, how we look at companies, how we look at data, and then walking through some of our findings at a global level, and then also the Dutch equivalents to those findings. So Equity is a company, but we're a company with a mission. And our mission, as Dita said, is to close the equality gap in the workplace with a comprehensive database on corporate gender equality and diversity and inclusion. So we believe that companies and investors also have a strong role to play in closing the gender gap. And we've also seen an increasing interest for gender-led investment products over the past 5 or 6 years, which is when we've existed. So what we do is we enable investors to make better decisions. So how we do that is we evaluate 5,800 companies every year. And these are companies that are listed on the stock exchanges, so mid and large cap companies, large companies in developed markets. And recently we've also added emerging markets to that list as well. So this is over 45 different countries. We look at 21 equality indicators. So we have a scorecard that scores companies on 19 of these, and we have a whole data set that covers all of these 20 indicators that go to our clients every year on all of these companies. We also have 10 years of historical data. And the reason that we provide this data for investors to make these decisions is because investing in women is not just the right thing to do, it's also a financially smart thing to do. So over the past number of years, we now have $8 billion USD investing in products using equity data. So these products are developed by companies like UBS, Amundi, HSBC, Morgan Stanley. And there's been various research that shows that investing in these companies actually gives better financial returns to investors as well. So a company called Glenmead, based in the US, they're an asset manager there. They did research that showed that companies that score the best on equity scorecards, or in the top quintile of performers on gender equality, also outperform the bottom quintile financially. So having a better score in gender equality also correlates with better financial performances. So when you invest in those companies, you're also doing better financially. Studies by BlackRock have also shown that companies with more diverse workforces tend to outperform their country and industry groups with less diverse workforces. So investors use our data for a variety of purposes. There's ESG integration, so they might already have data on environment and governance topics, and we add that social lens as well to it. They can do portfolio analysis, so look at the gender imprint of of a portfolio that they already invest in. Indices are an important one. So we work with Euronext, Solactive, Morningstar, Index, a number of different index providers to create financial indices that then others can create financial products with, so that investors can easily invest in these companies. In Europe, we have a few different ones. Euronext has, there's two in the Eurozone, so Euronext and Solactive will have a Eurozone index, as well as Euronext also has one for France. Companies can also do shareholder engagement, as well as controversy screening, so looking for risks in companies. This is how we evaluate companies. So the Equity Scorecard, it's a comprehensive look at how companies are doing on gender equality. So when Equity was founded in 2016, at the time there wasn't a lot of data for investors to use when investing in this topic. It was mostly just what's the percentage of women on boards and executive teams. And the founders felt like that wasn't really enough data. And so we use the UN Women's Empowerment Principles as an inspiration, and it covers, there's quite a lot of overlap with the principles. And we came up with these indicators in these categories, and to come up with an overall score for a company. So category A looks at gender balance in leadership of the workforce. So what we're looking for here for full points, a company will have 40 to 60% women at that level. So we're really looking for that balance aspect, but there's kind of a gradual scoring as companies get more and more women at each level. Category B is looking at equal compensation and work-life balance. We're looking at living wages, the gender pay gap, which we've talked about, I think, a lot today and is extremely important. We're looking at transparency on the gender pay gap, strategies to close it, as well as performance. So has the company actually closed that gap? We're also looking at parental leave for all parents and flexible work options. So flexible hours and flexible locations. In category C, we're looking at a number of policies that promote gender equality. And these cover a range of different things, from anti-sexual harassment policy to supplier diversity policies. Some of these are more gender focused. Some of these are looking more at a safe and comfortable workplace for everyone. Finally, in category D, we're looking at commitment and accountability. So we're looking for whether a company is a signatory to the UN Women's Empowerment Principles and whether they've undertaken a gender audit. So that's a third party coming in and auditing companies' policies and practices. So it's a really nice addition, I think, to the scorecard. We also look at controversies that a company might be experiencing. So we look at the news, we look at lawsuits on gender discrimination, sexual harassment, that sort of thing, and we keep track of all of those against companies so that clients can use that either for risk assessments, for screening, or if it's these controversies have advanced to a certain level, to exclude them from financial indices for a year as well. An important thing to know with the scorecard is that we're looking at company transparency. So all of our evaluations are based on information that the company has made publicly available. And so even if a company has a policy in the background, we do expect them to publish that so that they can be held accountable for it, and so that we know what they're doing. So I'm going to walk through some of the findings that we found. This is based on our 2024 report on developed markets specifically, so the 4,000 companies in developed markets. Our 2024 report is based on our 2023 data set. It's a bit about the scope. 4,000, it's 3,795 companies. They all have a market capitalization of USD 2 billion or higher, so that's mid or large cap companies, listed on major indices across the world in 27 different developed markets. That's 1,035 in Europe, and that's 44 listed in the Netherlands. So I think it's important to keep the scope in mind as we go through the presentation. The numbers that I have might look a little different than the ones that Sophie presented, and that's in part because we're looking at just 44 companies, and these are the mid and large cap companies in the Netherlands. For our methodology, the way that we evaluate companies, as I said, we gather publicly available information provided by the companies themselves. We do an internal peer review process, quality assurance, and we engage with the companies to allow them to validate the data, send us anything that we've missed, and also make sure that they understand how they're evaluated. And about 8% of companies participate in that process. We give them all a chance, but that's how many tend to apply. The key takeaways from the report, before I get into all the details, were that the journey towards gender balance is slow and it's a bit painful. It is happening. There's some encouraging trends, and I think we need to hold on to those glimmers, but it's unfinished. There's a ways to go. We also see that legislation plays a really important role in change. We would love for it to be very motivated by companies, and that's part of what we do, is we're trying to individually motivate companies to do this. But the biggest trends that we see are countrywide, even more so than sector-wide. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we see a lot more transparency in Europe, but also other places where legislation is picking up. Yeah. And a big finding is that in corporate management and leadership, it's still predominantly male. So first, I want to look at gender balance. So again, we define gender balance as 40 to 60% women at any level. And these are our global findings for 2024 and previously 2023. So we look at the percentage of women in CEO positions, board, and that's the supervisory board, executive teams, senior management, and the workforce. And you can see that there's a bit of a shift from year to year, but not massive. So we're seeing a lot of imbalance at the CEO level, with just 7% of women in CEO positions in 2024. At the board, it goes up to 30%, but then it comes back down to 22% at the executive, 27% in senior management, and then up to 38% in the workforce. So we're seeing globally this trend of a big dip as you go higher and higher in the company. Comparatively in the Netherlands, what we're seeing is actually quite similar to global trends. We see 5% of women CEOs in the Netherlands. In terms of real numbers, that's 2 out of the 44 companies, so not that many. At the board, we're seeing 39% women on average. That's actually quite a bit higher than the global averages and getting closer to balance. At the executive level, 22%, so pretty much the same as global averages. Senior management, 30%, a little bit better. And at the workforce, 37%, so a little lower. In Europe, we see 8% women CEOs, so a little bit higher than the global average. Boards at 38% women, so similar to the Netherlands, but also quite higher than the global average. Executives, 23%, senior management, 28%, workforce, 38%. So when you're kind of at the workforce, senior management, executive levels, these numbers are quite similar across the board, basically. We found globally 32 companies have reached gender balance, so that's 40 to 60% women. Yeah.
So where should we move?
We'll get there. At the moment, only 32 companies have reached gender balance at all corporate levels, and that's not 32%, that's 32 total out of 3,795. So we've got quite a ways to go. This is a small number, less than 1% of all companies, but it is nearly double than what it was in 2023. It was only 18 in 2023. So as we were saying, the progress is happening very slow. 15 of these companies, so about half, are European, 9 are from the UK, 4 from the Nordics, so Sweden and Norway, 1 from Germany, and 1 from France. At the moment, we don't see any Dutch company of these 44 that has gender balance at all of these levels. So looking at the top companies and countries, first of all, we'll look at the country ranking. It looks like a very busy chart at first, so I'll kind of pick it apart. Along the left side is the countries, and so we have the top scoring country average at the top, and we go down the list to the lowest scoring average. Across the top, we have our 19 scored indicators, and then along the right side, we have the average score in that country. I want to point out there's the score against our scorecard, and then there's also the relative ranking. So when we see here that France is in the top, so relatively, they're doing the best globally in terms of our scorecard, except their score is 57%, which isn't incredible. So I want everyone to keep that in mind, that they're doing the best, but there's still a long ways to go there. And what we can see in this chart, the darker green is a high score for that indicator, the darker red is the lowest score for that indicator, and then we have all the shades in between. So you see some where there's some pretty consistent dark green spots all across the board, and that would be mostly policies. So it's pretty simple. A company has a health and safety policy. A company publishes a training and career development policy. So those ones are lower weighted on our scorecard because it's more about just having that transparency, showing that they do this. Whereas we see a lot more variation at the beginning of the chart. So that's looking at the gender balance at the different levels of the workforce. So in the top performing companies, we see a lot more of that dark green, and that's because they're doing well. In France, for example, they've reached gender balance on average on boards. That's in large part due to legislation, but there's quite a mix of performance. Gender pay gap here, quite low. Living wage is also quite low. A lot of companies, that's the one that's the stickiest. They come back to us and they say, well, of course, we work in finance, of course everybody makes a living wage, and we really want them to claiming that and to be making sure that they're adjusting every year and paying attention to that, which we don't see. We also see very little attention to supplier diversity policies. That's pretty much globally. US and Canada, it's more popular, but in Europe and Asia, it's not so much. So we can see though that the Netherlands is number 5 here. And so, yeah, this is out of the 16 companies with over 40 companies in our data set. So it's a reasonable comparison to make. This is quite an improvement actually from previously. So in 2020, well, in the previous years, it had an average score of 39%, and it was 26% previously. So we've seen a really big improvement in the past couple of years in the Netherlands. These top companies, so we have France, Spain, UK, Norway, Netherlands. These companies tend to have more legislation related to gender equality, whether that's transparency or actual performance. So in France, they have quotas for the board, and that's having a quota of at least 40% women on the board. And now they've also introduced one for executive teams as well. And there's required transparency, not publicly, but to the government, in terms of gender pay gap and various other gender indicators. In Spain, companies have to report gender pay gaps publicly, and they also have to have extensive gender equality plans in place, which tend to cover all of the indicators on our scorecard as well. The UK has had gender pay gap reporting requirements since 2017. In Norway, there are mandatory gender quotas for the board at 40%, and they've maintained really high parental leave policies for a long time. And in the Netherlands, we see supervisory board quotas and steadily improving paternity leave. I think it's now 15 weeks, whereas when I started it a number of years ago, it was just 2 days. So it's actually quite encouraging to see that. Yeah, so the supplier diversity policy is actually looking for the company to proactively supply from women-owned businesses. And we see that a lot more in US companies and in Canadian companies. We don't see that quite as much in Europe, but it goes beyond just requiring the supplier to non-discriminatory, but to actually be owned by women-owned businesses. So the top companies globally for gender equality, we saw a high score of 80% this year, and that was from an Australian roadworks company called Transurban. And what I think is really interesting about looking at this top 10 list is that it's really a mix of industries. We have industrials, financials, consumer staples, utilities, real estate. So it's really companies from all over the world and from really different industries, and I think that's really important because we get a lot of feedback from companies saying like, well, we're an oil company, we're an energy company, of course we don't have a lot of women, we're never going to score well on your scorecard. But then when we show them this list, it might be harder, there might be more obstacles and more challenges, but it is possible. We do, and we have the proof. So I think that's nice to see here. Every year we publish a top 100 ranking, so out of these 4,000 developed markets companies, which are the top 100, and this is to kind of create incentive to these companies and publicity. Unfortunately this year there were no Dutch companies in the top 100, but there were a couple that were close. So the number 100 company was scoring 67% with a rounded figure, and there were a couple of Dutch companies that were meeting the score, but due to decimal places, they just didn't quite make it in. So that was NN Group and DSM Firmenich, so a financials company, materials company. So we are seeing a lot of engagement from Dutch companies, improving scores over the year. I think it's also interesting that the average score of Dutch companies is very good, but we're seeing less kind of top performance or outperformance. Whereas, for example, in Australia, they're a bit lower on the country ranking, but we see about 25 Australian companies in the top 100. So we see a lot of outperformers there. So I think in the Netherlands, what we're seeing is these good policies, like solid in terms of policies, in terms of parental leave. We'll go through a few different trends that we're seeing throughout the presentation. But I think maybe the missing piece might be that balance aspect of it, and that's also what's most highly weighted on our scorecard. So first I'll have a look at the gender pay gap, which already talked a bit about today. What we're finding is that gender pay gap disclosure is increasing. So in the previous year, only 22% of companies globally were publishing gender pay data. And now in 2024, we're seeing 33%. So that's quite a big increase. Still very low in total. 33% is not a lot, but this is a massive improvement. And then if we look at it by country, we can see that Spain is at 100%. There's legislation that makes it mandatory that these companies have to publish. UK is also very high at 86%. There's mandatory publication, but only companies of a certain size, so not every company meets that size requirement, and then it doesn't always do it voluntarily. We're also seeing Italy and Norway with quite a high figure. The Netherlands here is kind of in the bottom score at 41%. And it's not extremely high, but it's a lot higher than the previous year, where they had 21%. And to be honest, I don't know why this number is increasing, but it's a really nice trend, and it's a really interesting trend in a country where there isn't legislation on this. So that's really nice to see. Unfortunately, this number isn't so nice. Just 1.1% of companies globally have closed their gender pay gap. And we have a specific definition for what that means. We're looking for an unadjusted gender pay gap. So that's the average pay of women compared to the average pay of men, not adjusted for anything like age, tenure, education, etc. So this is a really strict look, and both are important. An adjusted pay gap shows non-discrimination in pay. That's an extremely important step. The gender pay gap shows the structural issues in a company. Where are women not making it to the highest paid positions? So we're looking for a mean unadjusted pay gap of 3% or less. The 3% to give a little bit of statistical wiggle room. But we're seeing a very small number of companies that have actually closed this. Only 41 companies, this 1.1% is 41 companies in the developed markets. It is 13 more than in the previous year, so again, a little bit of improvement. And this does include one Dutch company, Axel. So next we look at an important policy on the scorecard, and is an anti-sexual harassment policy. So 65% of companies globally have published an anti-sexual harassment policy, and again, this is publicly available. So companies might have this policy in the background, but we're looking for them to take a stand publicly so that they can be held accountable, and that employees know that this is something that will be taken seriously at the company. This has been one that's been a very positive trend, I would say, over the years. In 2021, only 39% of companies globally were publishing. That went up to 53% the next year, 60% last year, and now 65% this year. So it really is nice to see this trend. Could be, yeah. It could definitely. That was in 2017, so hopefully this is been a driver. Yeah. So here you can see that there's a few companies that are really pulling down the global average, but a lot are beating it this year, which is a nice shift from the previous year. And the Netherlands is one of the top performers globally with 77% of companies. You can see they're third on the list over there. And so this is up from 60% in the previous year. So this is really nice to see that Dutch companies are starting to make this public and publish this policy. We're also seeing this general shift of where in the previous year, there was quite a few companies that had less than 60% of companies publishing. And now that's really shifting. So there's only a handful of companies that aren't kind of meeting that 60% threshold. Next, we look at parental leave, and our requirements for parental leave policies match, at the moment, the ILO standards and EU standards. So for primary carers, so parents who spend more time with the child, we're looking for at least 14 weeks of fully paid leave. And by fully, we look for at least 2/3 of an employee's regular pay. And for secondary carers, at least 2 weeks to start scoring on our scorecard. And also, we take into consideration both statutory leave and company-sponsored leave, because ultimately what we want to know is what do employees at those companies have access to. We're also starting to do more analysis and look into equal parental leave policies, because of course, what we talked about, that career break penalty that a lot of women experience, and if all parents are starting to take equal leave, hopefully that shifts that penalty. So we do think that it's really important to offer equal leave, even though that's not necessarily what's scored in our scorecard right now. So we did find that 11% of companies globally offer equal leave. This is just looking at the equality, not the length. So this could be one week or more as a caveat, but we do see a bit of that, and we're paying more attention to it. In the Netherlands, of course, as most of you know, primary carers receive 25 weeks of leave, we include 6 weeks of pregnancy leave, 10 weeks of maternity leave, and 9 weeks of parental leave. And then we're seeing that 15 weeks for secondary care, including maternity leave, extended birth leave, and parental leave, which is, as I mentioned before, much more than it was a few years ago. So nice to see that. In terms of like comparison around Europe, Germany is offering 32 for primary care and 26 weeks for secondary carers. We're seeing Sweden and Norway offer very similar amounts of leave to the Netherlands, so around that 25, 26 weeks, but more for secondary care, so over 20 weeks in both Sweden and Norway. And in France, even though it's the best performing company in our scorecard, or country in our scorecard, they're not doing quite as well on leave, with 16 weeks for primary carers and 4 for secondary carers. Finally, we also look at gender equality in the supply chain. So our focus is, of course, on the company's home workplaces, but we recognize that these companies have a large impact on a huge supply chain as well. So we look for a few different policies there. We're looking at social supply chain management. So does the company prohibit child labor, forced labor, human trafficking, topics like that? We see that's quite common. It's gone up from 70% previous year to 80% this year. Companies are kind of on top of publishing that sort of policy. When we look at an anti-sexual harassment policy covering supply chain policies, that goes down quite a bit to just 40% this year, so less attention put on that aspect. When we look at supplier diversity policies, so this is something from women-owned businesses, this has gone up to 20% from 17% previously, but globally this is not a popular topic. Finally, we look at a living wage commitment for the supply chain, so a requirement for suppliers to pay living wages to employees, and that's just 11%. So we're seeing a lot less attention on the proactive policies and more attention on kind of the basic human rights policies. In the Netherlands, what we're seeing is that 95% of companies have a social supply chain policy, so above the global average, quite high. 43% have an anti-sexual harassment policy covering the supply chain, so that's a little bit better than the global average. None have a supplier diversity policy, so that's something that we would like to see more of. And 34% have a policy requiring suppliers to pay employees a living wage. So that is quite a lot better than the global average. So definitely some improvements that we're seeing in the Netherlands, some places where they're outperforming, except I think what we'd eventually like to see is definitely that shift to the 40 to 60% women at the different levels of the workforce.
so much for a very interesting presentation and very much in line with everything that has been said here. Also, extremely interesting how your company investigates some more social aspects of gender equality. I was wondering, when you speak about also checking how companies appear in the press and yeah, what is about their performance in practice. You were speaking about parental leave. In my research, I found that a lot of men, especially, have the permission to take parental leave, so there is a policy, but they don't actually take it because they feel forced because of the pressures at work or other things to just not take it. Is that something that Equity Link also measures?
No, unfortunately, we don't. We don't look at that. So we see that too. For example, in Japan, they have extremely long parental leave for both primary cares and secondary cares. I think almost, I think it's 26 weeks for secondary cares, but uptake is extremely low. And so there's definitely that cultural piece in a company, and that's really individual, and that's also very hard to collect data on. I mean, one aspect of it could be uptake of parental leave, but then it's a bit more complicated of a metric because then you have to look over who had a kid who needed that leave that year and didn't take it. So there's that aspect of it, but no, it's not something that we look at. But I think it's really important to not just what's available, but what does company culture encourage, and having senior leaders actually take that leave so that other employees know that they can too.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. It was really structured and clear. I just noticed that you talk about women in general, and I was just wondering, in your reports, do you also look at different ethnicities or like women of color, because they also, of course, fall more behind than Caucasian women. So I was just wondering if you, with your company, also look at that kind of data.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it's really important because, you see that the results would not be the same if we were looking at women of different race and ethnicities, and there's a huge intersectional aspect to this. This scorecard doesn't look at that, and there's a number of challenges to it. So what we've done is we've created a race and ethnicity and gender scorecard for the US specifically. So this is the first year that we've done research on this, and we'll have the scores for that next year. This scorecard is global. We can use it across countries and regions and sectors, and we don't have to adjust it for that. We say this is kind of our standard of what gender equality looks like, and it might be harder or easier to reach depending on the context, but this is the standard that we have. Whereas when we add race and ethnicity, it becomes a lot more complicated because for a few different reasons. One, it looks very different. So if we're looking at racial and ethnic diversity in a Japanese company, that's going to be, the categories are just going to be extremely different than in the US, for example. There's also a lot of reporting difficulties, so it's not legal to report this in a number of European countries. So that leads to a lot of, and there's important historical reasons for that, but it also kind of creates those visibility to those categories. But I think what we would do, we do see it as really important. It takes a lot of delicacy, I think, to create that, and also the scoring aspect of it. So that was a big challenge with the US scorecard that we were making, is what's good transparency, good diversity. So we say more diversity than less is definitely good, but what's full points? And so that's been a challenge that we've been working through, and I think we've come up with something pretty good, but we have to see what it see how it kind of lands in the market as well. But definitely an important aspect. I think it's just been a challenge to figure out how to do it in a fair and nuanced way.
Thanks.
Other questions?
In the United States, they have now elected Donald Trump with a majority on all the levels, also in Congress, the Senate, you name it. And one of the reasons that you
was elected is that men feel threatened by equal rights for women. In his government, that so far as we know, he is selecting men only. I wonder, what do you expect will be the effect in the United States in companies with gender policies and programs?
That's a tough one. I think we've already seen over the past year, especially, a big backlash in the U.S. to ESG data and to gender-lens investing and any kind of responsible investing. So, to be honest, it's been quite a tough year in the U.S. market, and we've really had to shift our sights to Europe and Asia, where there's a lot more interest and uptake on this. I think what I've heard from people working in diversity, equity, and inclusion in the U.S., it's also been a tough year for them. We see departments going from 15 people really growing up in 2020 to being cut to one person. So I think that, and lawsuits that are happening in academia against affirmative action, those are making their way to corporate America as well. So I think it's tough. I don't think it's going to be pretty. I think it's going to be hard for people working in this field. I think it's going to be a very big challenge, and I don't have an answer. I think it's hard to watch.
Maybe next year it was a different update.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, they're already kind of at the bottom of the list, so I don't know. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
One more question?
I thought so.
This is the last question. Thanks so much, Heather, for the really detailed and insightful presentation. I was triggered by the, let's say, the gender lens in different companies. Do you ever get questions from people who are looking for their next job about whether this is a gender positive, neutral, or negative place to work?
It's interesting. I've never had anyone reach out to us from that level, like as an employee looking for that data. We do publish our reports publicly, so you can see if the company you're applying for is in the top 100, but you don't see if the other 4,700 companies. What we have seen though is the top company a couple of years ago, it was called Murdoch. It's a real estate company in Australia. And we did see that on their HR website, they put across number one in Australia, the world actually. And so they were really proud of that and wanted to make sure that people in the company knew that as well. And we do see that companies can get a little stamp from us out of reports, either in the top 100 or the top 20 on the equity ranking. And we do see companies put that either in their website or in their company reports, especially these companies that are really making an effort every year and have a strong team. So I wouldn't say we get a huge